We have been working our way through the book of Zechariah, and today we're at chapter 11. And chapter 11, it's easily one of the hardest chapters of this book, maybe one of the more perplexing chapters in the Old Testament. Of course, Zechariah, as a whole, it records God's bringing his people back out of exile under the oppression of foreign nations back to their land, back to Israel, back to Jerusalem. They had to rebuild the temple, all kind of while being taxed into the ground by the Persians who were still ruling over them, trying to figure out what it means to be the people of God when the world doesn't make sense. Last week, we saw how faithful God is to transform us when he restores us. In fact, we even saw that the restoration work he'll do amongst his people, in the end, it'll be better than they were before they sinned and before there was judgment. And all of that still applies. But Zechariah 11 will address a part of the people of God, quote unquote, who at the end of the day just don't care. Zechariah 11, chapter 11, verses 1 through 17. This is the word of the Lord. Open your doors, O Lebanon, that fire may devour your cedars. Wail, O Cypress, for the cedar has fallen, for the glorious trees are ruined. Wail, oaks of Bashan, for the thick forest has been felled, the sound of the wail of the shepherds, for their glory is ruined. The sound of the roar of the lions, for the thicket of the Jordan is ruined. Thus says the Lord my God, become shepherd of the flock doomed to slaughter. Those who buy them slaughter them and go unpunished. And those who sell them say, blessed be the Lord, I have become rich. And their own shepherds have no pity on them. For I will no longer have pity on the inhabitants of this land, declares the Lord. Behold, I will cause each of them to fall into the hand of his neighbor, and each into the hand of his king. And they shall crush the land, and I will deliver none from their hand. So I became a shepherd of the flock doomed to be slaughtered by the sheep traders. And I took two staffs, one I named Favor, and the other I named Union, and I tended to the sheep. In 1 month I destroyed the 3 shepherds, but I became impatient with them, and they also detested me. So I said, I will not be your shepherd. What is to die, let it die. What is to be destroyed, let it be destroyed. And let those who are left devour the flesh of one another. And I took my staff Favor, and I broke it, annulling the covenant that I had made with all the peoples. So it was the word of the Lord. And then I said to them, if it seems good to you, give me my wages. But if not, keep them. And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. Then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. And I broke my second staff, Union, annulling the brotherhood between Israel and Judah. Then the Lord said to me, take once more the equipment of a foolish shepherd. For behold, I am raising up in the land a shepherd who does not care for those being destroyed, or seek the young, or heal the maimed, or nourish the healthy, but devours the flesh of the fat ones, tearing off even the hooves. Woe to my worthless shepherd who deserts the flock. May the sword strike his arm and his right eye. Let his arm be wholly withered, his right eye utterly blinded. This is the word of the Lord. Pray with me. Jesus, thank you that you speak out of strange texts just as much as you do the familiar ones. I pray your Spirit would be unbelievably merciful to where we are today, and that you would conquer the various forms of unbelief we're encumbered with every day. We know you're faithful. We know you'll do it. Help us see who you are in this, and help us see who we can be. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. The first thing this text shows us is that self-deceit trades restoration for destruction. Self-deceit trades restoration for destruction. Chapter 11 of Zechariah was written many, many years after chapter 10. And what was once a righteous rule under Zerubbabel's tenure as governor has likely turned into a hotbed of corruption. The images we're given in the first 3 verses depict the natural resources that dot the border of the land of Israel, sure, but they're also symbols of the glory and wealth that corrupt Jewish leaders and shepherds are accruing themselves from these bureaucratic alliances with the Persians that end up fleecing the people, the sheep, by the time everything's said and done. And that's corrupting the spiritual DNA of the community of faith. But the fullness of this text reveals, though, that the Jewish community actually preferred the situation under corrupt shepherds than the messianic kingdom God had promised them and the full restoration that would bring. It's a plot twist if there ever was one. A large segment of the people have embraced a life and a plot that has no real aim toward the restoration God's going to bring through. And they're complicit with their leaders in that corrupt system because they're remaining willfully blind to how far off track they've strayed. And even though the appearances of loyalty to God, to Yahweh, persisted through all of this in the religious life of the temple, that too is a lie God is not going to abide by. And that's why the passage opens up the way it does. There's a dark irony in the first 3 verses of this passage. It's imitating like a Jewish call to worship from the Psalms. So here's just like a blindfold and a dartboard, just a text from Psalms that will kind of let you know what I'm talking about. Psalm 24, lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Here's how our passage opens. Open your doors, O Lebanon, that the fire may devour your cedars. Wail, O cypress, for the cedar has fallen, for the glorious trees are ruined. Wail, oaks of Bashan, for the thick forest has been felled. The sound of the wail of the shepherds, for their glory is ruined. The sound of the roar of the lions, for the thicket of the Jordan is ruined. It's destruction that appears on the other side of the gates instead of their God. And Zechariah describes a wave of destruction coming out of the north, spilling south into Israel's borders. He's saying the sham of a life that the exiles have erected to suppress the knowledge that this is wrong. We're off track. We've lost sight of what we're doing here and the kingdom God's going to build. He's saying that sham won't last forever. The roaring lions in this text parallel the wailing shepherds, and I think Zechariah is doing that because they describe the wicked leaders kind of howling for hunger, right? It's because the habitat of their corruption and how they're enriching themselves has been destroyed. But the only reason that's been destroyed is because everything's been destroyed in that vision. You know what I mean? The dishonest systems of the shepherds and the people who willingly go along with it are going to be wiped out. Unless we think God's judgment of those suffering under that folly of leadership is unfair, God gives Zechariah it's a mission designed to fail for the right reasons. He gives him a mission to fail so Zechariah can see, and we can see, just what kind of darkness the sheep on the ground in Jerusalem have embraced in treading the life God was preparing for them for the one they're building themselves. And that's the second thing this passage shows us, is that not everybody wants to be restored. When God speaks in verses 4 through 6, he defies the conventional wisdom of most leadership theory. Because most would assume that the cold hearts of the sheep, the people in the exile community, were a product or were downstream from the cold-hearted leadership of the shepherds. But what God indicates is that in this situation in particular, the rot we're seeing in the leadership is a reflection of the rot inside the people. It went upstream. And the restoration of God's kingdom, it's stifled because the people are no longer interested in a kingdom and a life that looks different from the one they have right now. And God commands Zechariah to jump right into the filth of that weird, toxic leadership culture and start shepherding the people. And it's a dumpster fire. Zechariah joins the shepherds and attempts to lead the people back to the vision of the beautiful restoration God was doing. He takes two staffs. One of them was called favor, and the other one was called union. Favor, there, it describes it as a covenant with the nations. It just means the blessing God had given Jerusalem to keep them from being wiped out from like all the hostile surrounding nations. Like as bad as it is on the ground, it could be a lot worse. And God is he has almost a hedge around Jerusalem to keep them from being knocked off during this weird time when they don't have a city wall and all that kind of stuff. Union symbolizes the way God has brought together the two tribes or the two kingdoms that used to make up the nation of Israel, and has given a kind of unity among the people that has kept them from dissension this far. So Zechariah is stepping into that leadership role, leading with the benefits God has given Jerusalem up to this point. But there's something else there too about the staffs he's taking up. I think it's getting at Zechariah's efforts were sincere. Like he wasn't looking at this like a kamikaze or something. Oh, I can't wait to run this plane into the ground. He really means it. There's a sliver of hope that maybe God's people would acknowledge the rule of Yahweh over them is better than the cheap imitation they've exchanged it for in these relationships with the Persians. In 1 month, though, Zechariah says, I destroyed the 3 shepherds. I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure who those guys are. Nobody's really sure who they are. They're likely functioning, though, as the kind of ringleaders the wicked shepherds were doing to stir up dissension against Zechariah. And whoever they are, Zechariah takes them out immediately. It says destroyed there. I think the best way to bring that across is violently or forcefully restrained. Like he just took him out of the equation. And hearing that for the first time, you'd expect Zechariah's intervention in like sacking these clowns to be a cause of joy and celebration among God's people. You'd think. But it's not. The relationship between Zechariah and the sheep, it just falls apart. That's the end of verse 8. But Zechariah goes, I became impatient with them, and they also detested me. They're completely incompatible. And that word detest, that only shows up like twice in the Old Testament. It's an extremely loaded term, very visceral. It's describing almost like a gag reflex you'd have if you eat like bad food or something. He's saying the reaction to the good shepherd, God's shepherding activity among them, was actually revulsion. Because as it turns out, the people didn't want godly leadership. They wanted leadership that wouldn't rock their boat, would stay out of their way. It would simply let things continue as they'd been deteriorating and not disrupt the status quo. It turns out, as Paul says in Romans chapter 9, not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. And not all who are children of Abraham because they are his offspring. It's not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise that are counted as offspring. What he's saying there is allegiance to Yahweh is something internal. It's just not something you walk into. It's not something you inherit from your parents. It's not something that, well, we've always been a Christian family, and this is what we do. None of it works like that. Just because the exiles have descended from Abraham doesn't mean they're God's children. They've been around the community of faith, but it doesn't mean they're transformed. So Zechariah begins to learn, perhaps, what is the hardest lesson of the human experience. That not everybody who's sick longs to be well. Not everyone who's miserable wants to be happy. Not everyone who complains wants a solution. Not everyone at the bottom longs to rise. Not everyone who's lonely longs for family. At least, not if those things mean they actually have to change the way they orient themselves toward God and toward other people. Not if it means things can't just stay the same and they can't continue being the same miserable, bitter, self-absorbed people they've been grooming themselves into for years. They despise a shepherd and the order he brings until finally, those among the exiles who are not feeling God leading them in Zechariah as a shepherd, God gives up on. He gives up on them. That's verses 9 through 11. Zechariah goes, I will not be your shepherd. What is to die? Fine. Let it die. What's to be destroyed? Let it be destroyed. And let those who are left devour the flesh of one another. And I took my staff of favor and I broke it, annulling the covenant I had made with all the peoples. So it was annulled on that day. This kind of the same thing Jesus did in Matthew 23, just a few days before his crucifixion, when he cried, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together under my wings, but you were not willing. See, your house, as a result, will be left desolate. Because Zechariah's job as a shepherd, it's what they call a sign act in the Old Testament. It means that Zechariah, and this thing he's acting out amongst the people, it's how people will see what an invisible God is doing and feels like in their midst. It makes the invisible visible. And that's kind of terrifying for some of the malcontents in that group, because what it means is God is about ready to close up shop. That's what he wants them to see. And that would be the worst fate imaginable, for God just to back up and let you go. There's a community of science and engineering experts online. It goes under the name Vsauce. And Vsauce will make these YouTube videos about hyper-detailed thought experiments they'll do, right? So they use incredible math, incredible, knowledge of the field to answer weird questions nobody asked, but you're glad they did it anyway. So what they'll do is they'll look at a comic book where Superman punches through a titanium wall, and they'll say, okay, how fast would an average human hand have to travel in order to go through a titanium wall? And then come to find out, it's like Mach 89, and it would vaporize half the neighborhood if they did it. So they just kind of tease things out to their logical conclusions. It kind of lets you see the world in a different way. About a year ago, they asked a different question. They asked, what if the sun just disappeared? It won't, it can't, but what if it did? What if it just vanished? Well, they determined at the exact moment our sun disappeared, Earth would actually have no idea. For a small window of time, literally nothing would change. The Earth continues to orbit a sun that's not there, and it continues to be lit by a sun that no longer exists. It's because at 93 million miles, it takes light 8 minutes and 20 seconds to get here. And because gravity waves move at the same speed, it takes the same amount of time for the restraint the sun has on the Earth to vanish. It would look normal. But at 8 minutes and 20 seconds, that's when things go haywire. All bets are off. The Earth will be flung out of the solar system like a stone out of David's sling at about 70,000 miles per hour, tangent to where it was in the orbit before the sun disappeared. So it's just flying off into infinite blackness and infinite space until it hits something for the rest of time. But oddly enough, life on Earth would actually continue for a while. The average ambient temperature of our planet is about 57 degrees, all things considered. After the first week, without a sun, the Earth would cool to about 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Still doable. After a year, though, it's down to minus 100, or last Wednesday. What's interesting about that, though, is life would still kind of creep on for a little bit, even though it's shrouded in darkness. The only life that would survive after electricity and fossil fuels are no longer an option for light in the extreme cold are the organisms that are so hidden and shrouded in darkness beneath the chaos of the Pacific that they never knew the sun existed in the first place. It's all those weird sea monsters you see on the Discovery Channel that look like they're aliens. It's only creatures that thrive in darkness. And that would continue for perhaps billions of years. A miserable, cold life completely taken away from the illumination of anything more meaningful developing. I think the reason that's fascinating is because it's a great analogy to describe what happens when the author of life stops reining people in and vanishes altogether. Things go south. Romans chapter 1 says it this way: the worst thing that can happen to a person is that God removes any trace of his shepherding and influence and gives them over to what they want too much apart from his restraining power. He just lets you go off like a bottle rocket. That's what's going to happen to the sheep here in Zechariah. One author put it like this: God's greatest punishment is to give us that which we want too much. And the worst thing that can happen to us is that we are given what our hearts over desire. Take a man who worships his career. He serves it as something that will make him a somebody. It drives him and it dominates his life. Everything else fits around it. The worst thing that can happen to him is a promotion. It allows him to continue to think he can find blessing in his over desires, apart from the author of life. It convinces him that this is real life. It enables him to forget the wreckage he's making of his marriage, his family, his friendships, in order to pursue his God. Oscar Wilde put it a little more succinctly. He wrote, there's a novel called An Ideal Husband. He said this: when the gods wish to punish us, they start answering our prayers. I don't agree with it, but I know what he's saying. He's saying that we don't always desire what we ought. And then if God were to step away and let our desires spin out of control, we would go with it. That's the wrath of God, to finally give people, obstinate people, up to the things they want too much, apart from his shepherding influence. And when that happens, they become the worst version of themselves imaginable. They drift deep into the black, frigid wasteland of their own delusion, bitterness, and resentment, traveling only in that direction for the rest of their lives on earth and in eternity. What do you think hell is? It's when God's presence to restrain the corruption the fall caused is completely removed. And you're left to become what you would be apart from God's grace around you all the time. That's what happens. It's what's going to happen if repentance does not take place among the sheep. They actually begin to accelerate in the direction they were traveling while they still had a shepherd. That's what verse 9 is saying. Remember what Zechariah declares over them? What is to die, let it die. What's to be destroyed, let it be destroyed. And let those who are left devour the flesh of one another. So he's saying if the tendency of this flock is to drag their feet, slander one another, sell each other out, and eat each other, Zechariah's behavior is a sign that God was about to cut the brake lines, lash the steering wheel to the gear shift, drop a cinder block on the accelerator, and send that car right where it wants to go. What makes misery misery and in eternity hell is that people can become what they are apart from, the inconvenient things of God, like his mercy and his grace. I remember one time I was in Louisville, in Kentucky. We actually had a hurricane come through. It had lost all of this moisture on the coast of the Carolinas, but the wind structure still held together and made its way inland all the way to Kentucky. We don't get hurricanes in Kentucky. We're lucky if we get power and marriage that's not to our cousins. Anyway, but this hurricane came rolling through that nobody was prepared for. In Kentucky, all the power lines are above ground. That's something you guys do really well here. Everything's below ground. It's not an issue. So we had sustained 80-mile-per-hour winds for 2 days. And it knocked the power out everywhere. It was in late September. And so I'm living with a roommate in this crappy little apartment, and we're just trying to make the best of it. So we get out all the regifted candles, that we've got over the years and light them up and start playing some card games. And about a half hour into it, my roommate, Aaron, he goes, I got a police scanner. I got a battery-powered police scanner. Let's turn that on, see what's happening in the city, see what's going on downtown. It'll be fun. He turned it on, and nothing we heard was fun. The city started tearing itself apart. It's clear that the police were overwhelmed. They couldn't deal with the sudden lack of restraining grace on that community that comes with things like electricity. And we listened for about 2 hours as our city lost its ever-loving mind. We're dependent on God's goodness to temper our passions and our desires more than we know. I'm not saying that if God stops pursuing you and gives you over to the things you desire, you'll become like a mass shooter or a serial killer or something. I'm not saying you won't either. I'm saying that everything that makes you, you, will only add evil to the world that Jesus came to destroy. That's what I'm saying. Your conscience and your spirit become so darkened you can't even differentiate where the darkness ends and where you begin. That removal of grace and shepherdly pursuit makes you selfish and inwardly drawn. Nothing's beautiful, nothing's lovely, nothing's sacred except the stuff you want. That explains the rot you see if you've ever had the misfortune of being around a family where a wealthy parent dies. Because sometimes the grown children just go nuts. They start eating each other, claiming the armoire, claiming the grandfather clock, claiming the car, claiming the house, with no idea of what actually matters. They just go off into hyperspace somewhere. And the implication of all this is that God, as a judgment, gave these people leaders that would reveal that about themselves, but because some of them were totally obstinate in responding to the grace he gave them leaders that would take them there faster. That leads us to the third point this passage shows us, that the shepherd's warnings are as true as his promises. There's a fascinating exchange in this text where Zechariah is paid for his work. The transaction, it's meant to reveal how little the nation esteemed his efforts to bring them back to the vision God had given them. 30 pieces of silver at this point. According to Exodus, it was the minimum payment required for a slave. It's an insult. And so when Zechariah goes, pay me or don't pay me, you literally translate that, pay me or not, don't bother, I couldn't care less. It's so not about that at this point. He gets paid though, and God tells him, throw the payment back. Throw it to the potter, in verse 13. It's also one of those parts of this passage that are hard to know exactly what he's saying. I think it's safe to say, though, that since the core values of even the temple culture in this day were so screwed up, like everything else was, God tells Zechariah to launch that sack of silver into the temple area where the potter worked, probably to be melted down in the kiln. To just boil it down to its most simple, purest form. And that detail links Zechariah to the true shepherd himself 500 years later. Matthew's gospel connects to Zechariah 11 when he depicts the chief priests colluding with the Roman judiciary, financing Jesus' murder through Judas through 30 pieces of silver. The same money ends up at the same temple, just like in Zechariah. But since the Jewish leaders don't want blood money to be used for temple work, they bought something with it called the potter's field. It's just a field, an overflow burial ground, basically, that provides a place for Gentiles and out-of-country Jews to be buried if they die in Israel. There's something happening there. There's a foreshadowing. There's something about this shepherd's death. It makes room for those who actually want the kingdom he promises. And in both timelines, the rejection of Zechariah and the rejection of Jesus, it triggers a kind of series of events that would change the destiny of Israel forever. Jesus says something very ominous in Luke 21. He says in verse 20 through 24, "But when you guys see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains, and those who are inside the city depart. And let not those who are in the country go back in the city. For those are days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. Alas, for those who are pregnant and those who are nursing infants in those days. The people will fall by the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by Gentiles." Was he just being dramatic? Was Zechariah just being dramatic? Seeing the destruction that would come from the north? No, they weren't. It's a lesser known, shameful fact of history that Rome occupied Jerusalem in 63 BC, not by an invasion at first. It was by an invitation. The Jewish rulers called in a Roman general from Syria named Pompey, and they said, "Hey, we both want to rule this piece of soil. Help us decide who should do it." And Pompey decided on the elder brother, Hyrcanus II. But something changed. Hyrcanus was a king, but he was basically turned into a glorified tax collector as Pompey turned Jerusalem into Rome's cash cow. Over the next 100 years, Rome continued to corrupt the spiritual life of Jerusalem further, rotting Jewish leadership from within. Rome used the high council of the Jews, the Sanhedrin, to get their stuff done, and the Sanhedrin also used Roman officials to get stuff done. Sometimes they would even use, like a governor, maybe named Pontius Pilate, to authorize an execution of a guy who was threatening their power base. Some itinerant rabbi from Nazareth. And in a dark moment in Israelite history, as the Jews continued to descend in the nation being let go in some way, Pilate says to them, as Jesus is standing there, "Shall I crucify your king?" What do they say? "We have no king but Caesar. We're good." Imagine that 100 years before. This caused some Jews to wise up a little bit. Some of the extremists started attacking Roman garrisons until this guy named Vespasian from Rome decided that was enough. He came from the north and decided to set fire to everything he touched. The first thing he set fire to were these cedar trees from Lebanon. Then he moved on to the cypress trees. Then he tore the forest of Bashan. apart like they were tissue paper. And as if that weren't enough, he began setting up garrisons, military garrisons all over the map surrounding Jerusalem. He started in the Jordan, annihilating their thickets, displacing the wildlife so that animals could be heard calling for the habitat they once knew. 2 years later, the siege started. And Jerusalem thought they could fight for it, but they forgot. The staff called favor that protected them was broken. And so is the staff called union. And maybe that explains why, as Rome circled around in February of 70 AD, the Jews started fighting amongst themselves instead of fighting the Romans. 4 groups split into 5 groups split into 6. They started taking over different parts of the city. Pretty soon they started burning each other's grain reserves. The siege lasted till September, and they're out of grain. And there's a lot of dead, 600,000 dead, which is why they had to resort to cannibalism, eating each other, as the prophecy said, to make it through. Jesus' warnings about what it means to sell everything, follow him, and have that be a worthy investment, saying you'll find life in that, it's not just something artsy. It's actually true. The dude is right every single time. I have a few questions for us as we take stock. If the sin of the people was to cultivate a willful blindness to the life God had called them to, maybe we start there. Where have you cultivated a willful blindness in your life? If you pretend everything is all right when you know it isn't, you're guaranteeing the destruction of what you're trying to protect. And then you'll curse God for letting it fall apart. You have to allow the shepherd to lead you back to the life he's called you to. The gospel, hear me, the gospel frees you to say the truth about what's falling apart in here without the fear of rejection. So do it. Use the access you have to your great high priest. As I move on to the second point, I'm going to invite a few of the board members to come up to pray with us as we have a time of confession here, as you can move your way forward. The last thing I'll ask you, have you forgotten the beauty of the transformation you're promised? When the Holy Spirit tells you, you are not yet what you could be, does it remind you of your calling or does it cramp your style? There's a beauty in being transformed and opening yourself up to what the Spirit is doing in you. 1 John 2:17 puts it this way: the world with its desires is passing away, but he who does the will of God abides forever. What it's saying there is that you're being transformed from glory to glory in the midst of the world that's still raging against God. And it's proof to the heavens and to everybody else that God's kingdom is at work. The world's getting worse, but you're coming together. You're being made whole. Refraining from sin is a cosmic statement to the powers Jesus declared war on. It's not behavior modification. It's Jesus giving you a new nature and rewiring you slowly, painfully, surely over time. Let's move to a time of confession. Just take this time to take stock. Where have we cultivated willful blindness? And have we forgotten the beauty of the transformation Jesus has called us to.